On a freezing Alaska morning, U.S. veteran Jim Walker was flying his seaplane with his loyal German Shepherd, Rex, when something impossible appeared below. A massive SOS carved into the snow with burnt logs on an island no map ever mentioned. Jim wanted to ignore it, to stay in the sky where the world couldn't reach him. But Rex wouldn't look away. And when they landed, the dog led Jim to a truth buried in the snow, one that someone on that island would kill to keep hidden. Alaska in midwinter was not a place for the unprepared. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly, a white desert carved by brutal winds that roared across the tundra like an angry beast. The mountains loomed like jagged giants, their peaks swallowed by clouds heavy with fresh snow. In the distance, the faint lights of Anchorage flickered like dying embers beneath the storm-thick sky, the city barely visible from such altitude. Jim Walker, a 50-year-old retired U.S. veteran with a rugged face lined by years of war and solitude, guided his red and white bush plane through pockets of turbulence. The world below was harsh, unforgiving, and empty, the kind of emptiness Jim had chosen on purpose, because emptiness didn't demand anything from him. Rex, Jim's loyal German Shepherd, sat calmly in the co-pilot seat, a 7-year-old dog with a thick winter coat of black and tan fur, alert amber eyes, and the posture of a trained working companion. He was lean, muscular, and disciplined, shaped by the same environments that shaped Jim. Rex was no ordinary pet. He had once served as Jim's unofficial therapy partner during his transition out of the military, recognizing Jim's silent struggles better than any human could. Inside the cockpit, the heater hummed weakly, barely keeping the freezing air at bay. Outside, gusts of snow streaked past the windows, turning the world into a swirling gray corridor. Rex lifted his head as if sensing something that Jim had yet to notice. Jim checked his instruments. Altitude steady, airspeed stable, fuel sufficient for another 2 hours. His flying route had become a routine, a self-imposed patrol he conducted across the isolated valleys of southern Alaska, not because anyone asked him to, but because the sky was the only place where the memories quieted. Years before, in Afghanistan, Jim had witnessed the worst of humanity: ambushes, firefights, and the loss of people he cared for. Those ghosts lingered behind his eyes, haunting him whenever the world grew too still. Flying helped. Rex helped. Together they made the silence survivable. Jim exhaled, fogging the edge of his visor, unaware that his peaceful routine was about to shatter. Rex suddenly stiffened. His ears snapped forward, nose pressed to the cold glass of the cockpit window. A low, urgent growl vibrated in his throat, soft but impossible to ignore. Jim frowned. Rex didn't react like this unless something was wrong. The veteran leaned left, adjusting his view over the frozen valley below. At first he saw nothing but endless snowdrifts and lines of dark spruce bending beneath the weight of new snowfall. The wind carved ripples in the powder like frozen ocean waves. Then Rex barked, one sharp warning that cut through the drone of the engine. Jim's grip tightened on the control yoke. "All right, boy. Show me what you see." Jim banked the plane gently to the right, lowering altitude. The valley widened below him, a vast basin stretching between two ridges of steep, knife-like rock. Then something caught his eye, something unnatural. On an expanse of untouched snow stood 3 enormous letters carved from charred logs. SOS. They were dark, perfectly formed, and unmistakably human-made. Jim's chest tightened. No one should have been out here. The nearest trail was miles away, and the weather alone could kill a person in hours. Rex growled again, pressing his weight against the glass, as if urging Jim to understand the urgency. For the first time in months, adrenaline surged through Jim's veins. Jim's mind raced. An SOS this massive didn't come from a lost hiker. It came from desperation. Someone out there had worked through freezing temperatures long enough to drag heavy logs across deep snow and set them aflame. That kind of effort only happened when the alternative was death. But Jim also knew what answering distress signals could lead to: danger, entanglement, responsibility. He had spent years avoiding exactly those things. He had retreated to Alaska because here, no one needed saving from him, and he needed to save no one. Yet Rex kept staring, unmoving, breath fogging the window. Jim felt the dog's certainty press against his hesitation like a silent command. He circled lower, examining the area for signs of movement. Nothing. Only emptiness, the kind that felt wrong. The trees were still, the wind muted, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. No footprints were visible from the air, no smoke, no discarded gear. If someone was still alive, they were hiding, or couldn't move. Jim scanned for hazards. Snowdrifts looked soft, but concealed unpredictable ice shelves beneath. The frozen lake at the valley's center, however, lay flat and compacted, likely thick enough for landing. Jim exhaled shakily. The safest option was to call for help. But he knew radio signals were unreliable in this terrain, and Rex was growing agitated by the second. Jim reached for the radio out of habit, toggling the frequency, but the device only produced static riddled with faint crackles, another reminder that mountains and storms didn't care about emergencies. He sighed. The SOS looked old enough to have survived several nights of snowfall, yet fresh enough to still be visible. Someone had struggled here recently. The silence in the cockpit grew heavier as Rex's steady breathing filled the space. Jim met the dog's eyes. They were sharp, steady, resolute, the same look Rex had given him years ago on a battlefield when Jim was too shaken to move. Jim muttered under his breath, "You're not going to let me walk away from this, are you?" There was no answer. Only Rex shifting forward, ears perked, tail stiffened in focus. Jim tightened his gloves, leaned into the controls, and guided the bush plane toward the frozen lake. As he descended, the wind picked up, pushing the aircraft sideways. Jim fought the gust, leveling the plane just before touchdown. The floats skimmed the icy surface, kicking up shards of frost like shattered glass. After a few tense seconds, the plane slid to a controlled stop. Jim cut the engine, and the sudden quiet felt deafening. The cold seeped into the cabin instantly, reminding him of the reality outside. Rex stood, ready to move the moment Jim opened the door. Jim stepped out into the biting wind, snow crunching beneath his boots. The valley stretched out before him, vast, silent, and hostile. Rex bounded onto the ice, sniffing the air with purpose. The SOS sign loomed in the distance, dark and ominous against the endless white. Jim's instincts screamed caution, yet something deeper pulled him forward, the same thing that had once driven him to run toward danger instead of away from it. He adjusted his winter jacket, checked the pistol holstered at his side, and nodded at Rex. "All right, partner. Let's find out who's calling for help out here." And with that, they moved across the ice toward the unknown, the storm closing in behind them. Jim Walker stepped carefully across the frozen lake, the wind slicing through the valley like a blade as he and Rex moved toward the partially collapsed snow shelter ahead. The structure leaned awkwardly to one side, its packed ice walls buckling inward as if crushed by weight or struck during a struggle. Jim slowed his pace, his breathing steady, every instinct returning to the hardened discipline he developed over decades in the military. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something metallic. He swept the surroundings with his eyes, noting subtle disruptions in the snow. The first hints that whatever happened here wasn't an accident. Rex lowered his head, ears sharp, following a scent trail invisible to Jim. As they reached the ruined shelter, the grim details became unavoidable. A splash of dark, half-frozen blood stained the snow near the entrance, smeared across the icy ground in a dragging pattern. Broken gear lay scattered, a torn backpack strap, a crushed metal cup, a wool glove stiff with frost. Jim crouched beside the glove, examining it with practiced precision. It belonged to an adult, likely female based on the size and slender build. The glove's outer fibers were frayed, suggesting it had been yanked from the wearer's hand during a struggle. Rex growled quietly, his amber eyes locked on the snow trail leading away from the shelter. Jim followed Rex's line of sight and spotted deep furrows in the snow. Drag marks. Someone had been pulled, not walked, away from the shelter. The weight pattern suggested the victim had been unconscious or too injured to resist. Jim's muscles tightened beneath his winter jacket. The old instincts he thought he had buried surged back. The tactical awareness, the silent calculations, the sense of moving pieces he couldn't yet see. He rose from his crouch, scanning the tree line ahead. The forest stood unnaturally still. No wind rattled the branches. No birds called. The silence was oppressive, thicker than the falling snow, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Rex stepped forward, nose close to the ground, tracing the path of disturbed snow. Jim followed closely behind, ensuring every step was placed deliberately to avoid slipping into hidden ice pockets beneath the powder. The dragging path cut a straight line toward the forest border. As they approached the first row of spruce trees, Rex stopped abruptly and raised his head, sniffing with quick, sharp breaths. Jim recognized the behavior. It was the dog's way of confirming danger without vocalizing. Behind the tree line, shadows shifted slightly in the low afternoon light. Jim's hand moved to his holster, fingertips brushing the grip of his Colt .45. He didn't draw it yet, but he wanted the weapon close. They entered the forest, the atmosphere shifting instantly. The wind died, the temperature dropped. Snow muffled every sound except the crunch beneath Jim's boots and the faint, steady rhythm of Rex's breathing. The marsh trees grew dense, their dark branches intertwined like skeletal fingers blocking the sky. Drag marks continued deeper, and the blood trail grew more sporadic but still present. Small, frozen droplets clinging to pine needles, torn bits of fabric snagged on bark. Jim paused to examine one such fragment, a strip of light blue wool, possibly from a winter jacket. It smelled faintly of perfume, floral, subtle, something someone might choose for comfort during harsh travel. Whoever she was, she hadn't planned for violence. The forest tightened, the path narrowing as fallen branches created natural choke points. Rex slowed his pace, shoulders tensing as he sniffed at the base of a tree, where the blood droplets thickened again. Jim knelt, noting fresh snow displaced recently, likely within the last 24 hours. The cold would have preserved blood longer, but the lack of heavy snowfall around it indicated the trail wasn't old. His jaw tightened. Someone injured was nearby, or had been moved again. A raven's distant croak echoed, the first sound breaking the suffocating quiet. Jim turned his head sharply but saw nothing except more trees and the endless veil of white. Rex suddenly veered left, away from the drag path. His tail stiffened straight out, a clear signal of detection. Jim followed, stepping over a fallen spruce trunk, dusted with ice. 20 yards ahead, something glinted faintly against the snow, a metallic flash out of place in the wilderness. Rex reached it first, stopping with a low rumble. Jim closed the distance quickly and saw the object half buried in snow, a hunting knife with a black composite handle. The blade was stained with dried, dark red blood, thick enough to suggest a deep wound. Jim lifted it carefully using a patch of cloth. The cut patterns indicated a struggle, not an accident, and the knife's design, sturdy, practical, suggested it belonged to someone familiar with Alaska's harsh environment. Jim scanned the surroundings again, instincts sharpening into full combat readiness. The knife wasn't simply dropped. It had been planted, intentionally or by frantic movement during a fight. Footprints were scarce, but faint indentations nearby suggested at least 2 people had passed through. A larger, heavier individual, and a lighter one. The victim. Jim's breath clouded in the frozen air as he pieced together the scene. Someone strong enough to drag another person had carried or chased them through the woods. The victim had fought back, leaving blood and the weapon behind. But there were no bodies. No additional supplies. That meant the situation was still unfolding. Not over. Rex circled the area, nose sweeping in long arcs, then returned to Jim's side, posture rigid. Jim touched the dog's head briefly, grounding himself. "You're doing good, partner," he murmured. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too expectant. Jim's years in combat zones taught him this sensation well. The calm before a revelation or an ambush. He scanned the treetops, the snow, the shadows between trunks, building a mental map of possible exit points and hiding spots. Whoever had caused this violence might still be close, and if the injured person was alive, every second mattered. Jim moved deeper into the woods, following Rex's lead. The air grew colder, the visibility dimming as clouds thickened overhead. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, soft but relentless. The forest floor sloped downward toward a narrow ravine where the drag trail ended abruptly. Jim crouched at the edge, noting disturbed snow and broken branches below. Someone had gone down into the ravine, either by force or as part of an escape. Jim studied the descent line, judging the angle and the danger it posed. He felt Rex lean forward beside him, scanning the depths. Somewhere down there, the next clue waited. Jim tightened his gloves, inhaled the icy air, and prepared to climb. Jim Walker descended carefully into the narrow ravine, one gloved hand gripping a rocky ledge while Rex moved lightly ahead, expertly navigating the steep slope. The ravine was colder, its walls trapping wind and shadows. Fresh snow had been violently churned up at the bottom, forming a chaotic crater-like depression as if something large, or someone, had hit the ground hard. Jim's boots sank deep with each step, crunching through layers of disturbed powder. Shards of splintered wood and torn bits of fabric littered the white pit. Rex stopped abruptly, nose darting in sharp circles before he pawed at a mound of collapsed snow, exposing a corner of something dark and weather-stained. Jim crouched, brushing aside the icy crust, revealing a small leather-bound journal. The journal was cracked at the edges, its surface worn and stiff from freezing temperatures. Jim opened it gently, careful not to tear the moisture-fragile pages. The handwriting inside was neat at first, written in delicate cursive strokes belonging to someone meticulous, likely a woman. The first intact page mentioned a name, Emma. Jim paused, picturing her, perhaps in her early 30s, based on the youthful curves of her handwriting, someone who preferred soft pen strokes and that faint floral scent that lingered on the pages. The next lines referenced her husband, Michael, a strong-built man in his mid-30s with a trimmed brown beard and a quiet, grounded demeanor, the sort of man Emma described as steady like the Alaska pines. They had traveled on a snowmobile through the valley 2 days prior. Jim flipped to a later entry, written shakier, the lines slanted. Emma described the sudden avalanche that struck them while crossing a narrow ridge. Their snowmobile had flipped violently, sending both into the ravine. Michael had gotten the worst of it. Emma wrote that he had a deep leg gash and possibly broken ribs. She had dragged him into a makeshift snow hollow, binding his wound with strips torn from her scarf. Jim imagined her small frame, slender but wiry, pale skin flushed from cold, long brown hair probably tied back beneath a wool cap, struggling through the storm to keep Michael alive. She mentioned building an SOS sign with burned pine branches, hoping a pilot might pass overhead. Jim tightened his grip on the journal, feeling the weight of her hope trapped inside frozen ink. A faint gust swept through the ravine, flipping a page on its own. The next entry detailed the moment help seemed near. Emma wrote she heard a distant engine, a plane. But before she could finish describing her excitement, the writing shifted abruptly into jagged, frantic lines. Jim's jaw tightened as he read her words. She wrote that 2 men approached their camp, dressed in mismatched Arctic gear. She described them vaguely. One tall, with a gaunt, bony face, patchy beard, and cold blue eyes. The other shorter, bulkier, with sunken cheeks, and an old scar running across his nose. Their clothes were grimy, their gloves stained with something dark. They claimed they were lost travelers, but their mannerisms were wrong. Emma wrote they did not act confused or cold. They acted like predators circling prey. Jim turned to the next page. The handwriting had become an uneven scrawl, slashing across the paper as if Emma wrote in a panic. She described how Michael had tried to stand when he realized the men weren't rescuers. She described his voice, deep but shaking from pain, as he told the men to leave. The shorter man struck him with a tool handle, knocking him into the snow. Emma wrote she screamed, but the tall man clamped a gloved hand over her mouth. She bit him, kicked him, fought with every ounce of strength she had. Her words captured her terror vividly, the ink pressed so hard it dented the page. Jim felt the emotional punch, imagining her desperation unfolding right where he now stood. Rex gave a low whine, drawing Jim's attention back to the final pages. Jim unfolded a partially torn sheet tucked between entries, a note Emma must have written quickly. Ink bled at the edges, frozen into tiny, icy webs. It read, "Michael's breathing is worse. I can't move him alone. The men left but said they'd return when the storm settles. They took our food. I hear them moving somewhere in the trees. If anyone finds this, please help. Please. They are not rescuers. They are hunting. They are coming back." The final sentence had been scratched hastily, the letters jagged and desperate. Jim closed the journal slowly, feeling its weight expand inside him. This wasn't an accident. This was a threat, deliberate and calculated. Jim slipped the journal into his jacket, standing fully as Rex nudged deeper into the ravine. The dog pressed forward, ears taut, tail stiffened, following a scent line that curved around a jagged outcrop of stone. Jim followed cautiously. More debris appeared, a torn piece of blue fabric matching Emma's coat, a broken thermos, and a blood-soaked bandage frozen stiff. Jim picked it up carefully. It was Michael's. Emma had described ripping her scarf to bind him, meaning anything stained this dark must have been the makeshift dressing falling apart. The realization meant Michael might still be alive, but worsening. Jim's pulse quickened. The timing mattered. Every minute in Alaska's cold could be fatal. Rex suddenly stopped at a shadow-filled recess near the ravine wall. Jim froze behind him, lowering himself quietly. Tracks were visible, several boots trampled into the snow. One set was deep and heavy, the other 2 lighter and more erratic, likely Emma's and Michael's. Jim examined the indentation pattern. The heavy boot prints were fresh, edges crisp, not softened by snowfall. The 2 men had returned recently. Jim scanned the trees above. The ravine's tapered shape magnified sound. but the forest beyond remained deathly quiet. The snowfall was starting again. Small flakes, drifting silently like ash. It made visibility worse, concealment easier for hostile watchers. Jim's combat instincts surged. He signaled Rex to stay close. They moved forward until the ravine widened into a small basin surrounded by layered rocks. Clothing remnants and collapsed snow suggested someone, likely Michael, had been resting here. Jim imagined him, mid-30s, strong build, brown beard, once steady and calm, now pale, weakened by injury, breath shallow, lying helpless while Emma shielded him. But the basin was empty now. Jim knelt, touching the snow where the imprint of a body had been. It was still faintly warm beneath the top layer, meaning whoever had been here was moved recently. Either Emma dragged Michael further, or the two men took them. Rex turned his head sharply, focusing on a narrow crack between two stone slabs at the basin's edge. Jim leaned closer. Something metallic glinted again. This time a button from a man's winter coat. Not just any button, a military surplus one. Jim recognized the style. The two men Emma described weren't ordinary wanderers. Their gear was mismatched but included military leftovers, likely scavengers or criminals hiding in the wilderness. Jim's expression hardened. The landscape around him suddenly felt like a battlefield again, the silence no longer natural but tactical. He studied the terrain. The tracks up the slope were new. The men had dragged someone toward the tree line above the ravine. Without hesitation, Jim stood, tightening his gloves. He felt the old clarity return, the clarity that had carried him through war. Rex let out a single deep woof. A warning. Jim shifted focus instantly. Snowflakes drifted faster now, swirling like veils, but through the blowing white he saw faint movement higher on the ridge, a tree branch shifting unnaturally. It wasn't the wind. Someone was up there, watching. Jim steadied his breath. He was no longer following a mystery. He was stepping into an active threat. With the journal pressed to his chest and Rex poised beside him, Jim started up the slope. The hunt had begun. Jim Walker climbed the last stretch of the ravine slope, with Rex pressed close beside him, the cold wind tearing sideways across the ridge as snow drifted in disorienting veils. The forest ahead felt dense, watching, and the tension from Chapter 3 clung to the air like static. Jim adjusted the journal inside his jacket, its weight grounding him as he scanned the tree line. Then, a sound broke through the storm, a low groan. Rex's head snapped toward the noise instantly, ears sharp, body rigid. A figure stumbled out from between thick spruce trunks, half limping, half crawling, like a man who had reached the end of his strength. Jim's hand moved to his sidearm as the figure collapsed in the snow. The man looked up, face pale and strained beneath a layer of frost. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, matching Emma's description of her husband. Medium-length brown beard, short chestnut hair matted with snow, gray-green eyes that should have held the steadiness she wrote about, but didn't. His expression flickered between panic and calculation, his breath hitching in theatrical gasps. "My name. Michael," he rasped, gripping his leg dramatically. "Please, please, help me. They took Emma." Jim crouched slowly, but didn't holster his weapon. Something about the man felt wrong. The timing, the appearance, the barely there tremble that looked more practiced than genuine. Rex circled tightly, hackles raised high, growl rising from deep within his chest. Jim trusted that growl more than any word spoken by strangers. He studied the man carefully. The supposed injury was wrapped in a tight, meticulously layered bandage using clean strips of thermal fabric. Too clean, too precise. No scavenger on the run would have the time or clarity to make such a perfect pressure wrap. Jim noticed the edges of the cloth were cut straight, not torn, and there was barely any fresh blood seeping through. "You're Michael?" Jim's voice was flat, interrogative. The man nodded weakly. "They took my wife. I escaped. I need your help." Jim's military instincts sharpened. Emma's journal stated clearly that Michael had been too injured to walk at all and had been unconscious for most of her entries. But here stood a man not only moving under his own power, but talking clearly, controlling his breath, and performing desperation like an amateur actor. Jim reached forward and lifted the bandage slightly. The man jerked in exaggerated pain, but Jim ignored him. The wound underneath was indeed real, a deep gash, but older than the journal suggested, partially healed with antiseptic residue. "Who bandaged you?" Jim asked. The man hesitated. "Emma, before they took her." Jim didn't answer. He already knew Emma had only torn her scarf and had no medical supplies. Rex stepped forward, barking sharply once, a clear rejection. The man flinched violently, raising his hands in a defensive posture too quick and trained to be spontaneous. Jim's eyes narrowed. "Stand up," he ordered. The man hesitated. I can't." Jim grabbed the man by his collar and pulled him upright. The man rose far too easily for someone claiming near collapse. His muscles tightened subconsciously, revealing strength and combat readiness beneath the layer of helplessness he tried to portray. Jim felt the shift instantly. This man wasn't Emma's Michael. He was someone conditioned, someone used to surviving in harsh environments. Jim shoved the man toward the partially sheltered spot behind two leaning spruce trunks, a small natural alcove shielded from the wind. "You're going to sit there," Jim said. The man froze for a moment before forcing a pitiful nod. Jim removed a length of rope from his pack, a thick military-grade cord, and bound the man's wrists and ankles with precise knots. The man didn't resist strongly, only protested weakly. "I'm the victim here. You're making a mistake." Rex growled again, leaning forward until his teeth were inches from the man's face. The man flinched hard, a genuine flinch, the kind predators make when confronted by a bigger predator. Once restrained, the man tried again to plead. "I'm telling you the truth. My wife, she needs help." Jim didn't bother responding. Instead, he checked the man's pockets. He found a small folding knife, a flint striker, and a ration pack, supplies no injured man fleeing kidnappers would carry neatly on his belt. Jim dropped water and a protein bar beside him. "You'll stay here. You have enough to survive. Try anything and Rex will finish what I don't." The man swallowed hard, and for the first time his mask cracked, revealing something cold and calculating behind his eyes. Jim walked away without waiting for another lie. Rex stayed close to Jim's side as they left the fake Michael behind. Snow muffled their steps, the wind thickening with each passing minute. Even as they moved deeper into the forest, Rex looked back repeatedly, ears pinned, as though ensuring the imposter wasn't attempting to escape. Jim trusted the dog's instincts. The forest ahead was more crucial. Emma and the real Michael were still missing, and the two hunters she described were somewhere close, maybe even watching. Jim's expression hardened. The fake Michael wasn't a messenger. He was a decoy, placed intentionally to slow or mislead any rescuer who found Emma's journal. As Jim and Rex reached the deeper canopy of the spruce forest, the footprints shifted. Drag marks mingled with boot tracks, leading north toward a narrow passage between two ridges. Jim crouched to examine them, recognizing three patterns. One heavily weighted set dragging something large, likely Michael, a lighter set matching Emma's size, and a set of deep, crisp prints heavier than all the others, belonging to one of the hostile men. The trail was clearer now. The hunters were moving deliberately, not fleeing. They had a plan for their captives. Jim's breath formed clouds as he inhaled the cold, letting focus sharpen into the familiar state soldiers enter before contact. A distant thud echoed through the snowfield, dull and out of rhythm with the wind. Rex stiffened instantly. Jim raised a hand, signaling him to pause. The forest absorbed sound unnaturally, but Jim recognized that type of noise. A heavy object striking wood or ice, a camp, a tool, a weapon. Something was ahead. Jim exchanged a silent look with Rex. Snow drifted through the trees like falling ash as they moved again, following the footprints toward the source. The false Michael's presence confirmed one thing. This wasn't random violence. This was organized. And Emma's final words, "They are coming back," weren't a warning of return. They were a warning that the hunters never left. Ahead, through a break in the branches, Jim saw faint movement, a shadow shifting, a flicker of orange from a covered fire pit. Rex lowered his body instinctively, moving like a silent arrow through the snow. Jim followed, each step precise, controlled. Whatever awaited them, it was close. And now that the deception had been uncovered, Jim knew the hunters were expecting pursuit. He tightened his grip on the journal in his jacket and whispered to Rex, "Let's finish this." Jim Walker moved through the narrowing corridor of spruces with Rex, leading at a steady but urgent pace, the dog's nose cutting through the cold air in sharp inhalations. Jim felt the forest closing in around them, thicker and darker than before. Rex slowed at first, then suddenly pressed forward with more certainty, pulling toward the northern slope. That was when Jim caught it, a faint but unmistakable scent carried on the wind. Diesel. Someone had been running a generator recently, or a snow vehicle. Mixed with it was the acrid hint of smoke from wet wood, the kind that clings to clothing and skin. Rex inhaled deeply again, then turned sharply toward a rocky depression at the base of a glacier ridge, snow swirling in tight spirals as if trying to hide the secrets below. Jim followed Rex down a narrow descent, gripping the frozen rock as they made their way along the edge of the ice basin. The smell grew stronger, and as the wind shifted, another scent blended in. Human sweat saturated with fear. Rex halted before a jagged split in the glacier wall, a natural crevice partially concealed by a thick fir tree bent low by snow. Jim brushed aside the branches and saw it. A small wooden cabin, nearly invisible in the shadow of the ice ridge. The structure was built from rough-cut logs, patched in places with sheet metal and insulation foam. Smoke leaked faintly from a crooked stovepipe. No windows faced the opening, and only a single reinforced door met the front. Jim dropped his voice to a whisper. Whoever built this did not want to be found. Rex crouched low, head level, ears pinned forward. Jim scanned the clearing. Snowmobile tracks, 2 sets, led behind the cabin to a small shed half buried by drift snow. The prints were large, purposeful, and consistent with the boots he saw near the ravine. This was their base. Jim crept toward the cabin, placing his feet deliberately to avoid crunching snow. From inside came muffled voices, one rough, irritated male, the other weak, fading, and barely audible. Jim recognized the faint groan. Michael. The real one. A deeper male voice barked an order, followed by the clatter of metal. Jim pressed his back to the side of the cabin, feeling the cold seep through his jacket. Rex remained beside him, tail low, breath silent. Jim counted the shadows inside based on movement and sound. 2 captors, one near the door, one farther in. Jim positioned himself beside the doorframe, Rex aligned at his left heel. Jim tapped Rex's shoulder lightly, silent command for readiness. Jim raised his boot gently and tested the door latch. It was secured by a simple wooden peg, not locked. A bad mistake for men who thought they were alone. Jim shifted his weight, inhaled deeply, and slammed his shoulder into the door. It splintered inward with a violent crack. The man guarding the threshold, a thick-bodied brute with a heavy jawline and a tangled beard, reacted too slowly. Jim struck first, driving an elbow into the man's temple before the brute could reach the hatchet at his belt. The man stumbled, dazed. Jim followed with a knee to his ribs, dropping him unconscious across a wooden crate. Rex lunged past Jim in the same instant. Inside the cabin, the second captor, tall, gaunt, with icy blue eyes identical to Emma's description, reached for a long hunting knife. Rex crossed the cracked wooden floorboards in 2 silent leaps and crashed into the man's torso with full force. The man toppled backward, slamming against the wall. The knife clattered out of his hand as Rex's jaws closed around the man's forearm. Not to tear, but to disable. Jim rushed inside, kicking the knife away and securing the gaunt man with zip ties stripped from the table. The man cursed through clenched teeth, breath sharp with pain. If Rex had wanted, the man would have lost an arm. Jim gave Rex a quick nod. Good work. Rex released the forearm and stepped back, still growling. At the far end of the dim cabin, Emma huddled beside the bed where Michael lay. Her face was pale beneath layers of grime and cold, dark circles beneath her brown eyes betraying exhaustion. Her long brown hair had come loose from its tie, frozen strands clinging to her cheeks. Her blue coat was torn at the sleeve. She turned, startled as Jim approached. Then relief washed over her expression. You found us, she whispered, her voice trembling from shock and days without real rest. Michael lay half-conscious, shivering violently under a pile of filthy blankets. His beard was overgrown, his skin waxy, lips cracked. Fever radiated from him like a furnace under the icy air. Jim knelt beside the bed and lifted Michael's sleeve. His arm burned with fever, and the wound on his leg, revealed beneath makeshift bandaging, was swollen, angry red, and leaking an infection that had begun spreading. Jim's jaw clenched. They were running out of time. Emma pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting tears. He needs help now. They said they had medicine, but it was all lies. Jim steadied her trembling shoulder. We'll get him out. Rex and I have you now. Emma exhaled shakily, and finally let her panic soften into trust. Her voice broke again when she added, The one who came to you, the man pretending to be Michael, he's with them. He helps them trap people. They make the SOS look real, so pilots land. Jim absorbed the truth with the grim weight of inevitability. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed the scale of the operation. Emma clenched her hands together. They take supplies, gear, anything they can trade. They don't care who gets hurt. Jim stood, scanning the cabin again for any signs of additional danger. Hidden weapons, radios, traps. The structure was small, crude, built for concealment, not sustainability. A single lantern flickered weakly on a shelf, illuminating boxes marked with fuel symbols and unregistered medical supplies. These weren't lost men. They were backwoods smugglers using Alaska's isolation to prey on whoever crossed their path. Jim secured the second captor beside the first, binding them both tightly against a support beam. Rex stood guard, teeth slightly exposed. The unconscious brute groaned, but neither man was going anywhere. Jim checked the door once more, reinforced it with a wooden beam from the floor, then turned back to Emma and Michael. Jim retrieved a thermal blanket and wrapped it around Emma's shoulders. She shuddered, not from cold, but from relief. Thank you, she whispered. Jim nodded. We need to move before the fake Michael returns. He knows I found your journal. Emma's eyes widened. Then he'll know you're close. He won't run. He'll ambush. Jim lifted Michael carefully, cradling the man's weight against his chest. Despite the rugged build Emma had described in her journal, Michael felt light now. Far too light. His fevered breath brushed against Jim's jacket in weak puffs. Emma gathered what few supplies were still usable and followed Jim out into the cold. Rex pushed through the doorway first, scanning the clearing head to toe with hyper-alert precision. The wind had shifted again. Snow drifted harder, obscuring sightlines. Jim looked toward the darkened tree line where two ridges converged. Somewhere beyond that was the man pretending to be Michael, now aware his role as decoy had failed. Jim tightened his grip on Michael's weight, shifting balance through the snow. "We move," he said. Emma nodded and followed close behind. The forest swallowed them quickly as Rex led them up the ridge. Jim could feel it, an oppressive awareness stalking them. The fake Michael wasn't running. He was waiting. Jim Walker pushed through the tightening wall of spruce branches as he carried Michael's limp, fever-hot body toward the frozen lake, where the bush plane waited. Emma followed close, her slender frame wrapped tightly in the thermal blanket Jim had given her. Her long brown hair, still tangled and stiff with cold, clung to her cheeks as she fought to keep pace. Rex moved ahead in a steady, sweeping pattern, sniffing the air with sharp bursts. Jim knew the dog had already sensed something he hadn't voiced yet. The deeper silence in the trees. The smell of snow disturbed recently, the way Rex's stance grew lower with every step toward the ice. Jim kept moving forward, boots crunching through the soft new layer of snowfall. The sky dimmed under a thick gray curtain, weather turning again. They reached the tree line, and the frozen lake opened before them like a barren metal plate. The bush plane sat at the far end, its red and white frame dusted with a fresh coat of frost. Emma exhaled a trembling breath of relief. "We're almost there," she whispered, half to herself, half to keep hope alive. Jim nodded, though his instincts screamed caution. He adjusted Michael's weight, feeling how weak the man had become. Michael's beard was damp with fever sweat, his skin pale beneath the flush of infection. His breath rasped against Jim's jacket in shallow bursts. "Hang on," Jim muttered, "almost safe." But Rex suddenly stopped halfway onto the ice, hackles raised like a ridge of black needles. Jim felt it then. The wrongness, the shift in air pressure, the faint scrape of a boot on ice behind them. He turned, just as a figure stepped from behind a thick spruce trunk at the lake's edge. The fake Michael. He looked even more menacing without the pathetic act he'd worn earlier. His short brown beard bristled, his cheeks flushed from exertion, and his eyes, gray-green like the real Michael's but colder, held no panic now, only predatory focus. He wore a heavy winter coat with the hood down, revealing a narrow scar along his jawline that Jim hadn't noticed before. In his hands was a black semi-automatic pistol aimed directly at Emma. Emma froze. Her breath caught. Her eyes went wide, filled with recognition and horror. "You," she whispered. The fake Michael smiled. Not kindly, but with a thin, calculated curl of his lip. "You keep running, sweetheart," he said in a low, mocking tone, "but you never make it far." Emma stepped backward instinctively, her boots sliding slightly on the ice. Jim's pulse surged. He shifted his weight, but the layers of his thick winter parka trapped his arm against Michael's body. He wouldn't be able to reach his Colt, .45, in time. He'd be shot before his glove cleared the pocket. The fake Michael knew it. He angled the gun toward Emma's chest. "You're coming back with me?" Jim's mind raced, every second stretched thin as wire. He felt the cold blade of helplessness press against his ribs. until instinct overtook thought. He drew one breath and shouted the only command that could shift the outcome. "Rex!" The dog exploded into motion. No bark, no warning, just a streak of black and tan fur cutting across the ice like a missile fired straight from Jim's chest. The fake Michael barely had time to turn his head before Rex slammed into the side of his injured leg with bone-cracking force. The man cried out as his knee buckled violently. The pistol fired, a wild shot cracking into the ice several feet away, sending up a spray of shards. The gun flew from his hand and slid across the frozen surface with a skittering metallic screech. Emma stumbled away as the fake Michael collapsed onto the ice, grabbing his leg with a snarl of pain. Rex spun instantly, teeth bared, standing between the man and the gun. Jim lowered Michael quickly but gently onto a coat he threw down for insulation, then sprinted across the ice with the kind of speed men only regain under fire. The fake Michael tried to crawl toward the pistol, fingers scraping desperately against the ice. His face twisted, the mask fully broken now, nothing left but feral intent. Jim reached him in 3 strides. He dropped onto the man, driving a knee between his shoulder blades and wrenching his arms behind him. The fake Michael fought with surprising strength, but Jim had fought stronger. He forced the man's wrists together and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty zip ties. "You're done," Jim growled, his voice low and cold. The fake Michael spit a curse through gritted teeth, thrashing until Rex pressed his jaws lightly at the man's ear, just enough pressure to freeze him in place. Emma watched from several feet away, shaking, her hands pressed to her chest. Her breath came fast and uneven as fear drained into shock. Jim tightened the restraints until the man stopped struggling. The adrenaline in Jim's veins throbbed like fire, but he kept his voice calm. "Emma, it's all right. You're safe." She nodded slowly, swallowing hard as she stepped away from the ice cracks left by the stray gunshot. Jim hauled the fake Michael upright and dragged him toward the tree line, where a fallen spruce provided enough cover to secure him. The man glared with a hateful tension in his jaw, his breath coming in cold bursts. "You should have left us alone," he spat. Jim ignored him and tied the last knot. "You tried to bait innocent people," Jim said sharply. "That ends today." The prisoner sneered, but offered no reply. When Jim stepped back, Rex positioned himself like a sentinel, eyes fixed on the restrained man, making clear there would be no second attempt. Jim hurried back to Emma and Michael. Michael's breathing had grown shallower, his fever heating the cold air around him. Jim lifted him again, careful but fast. "We need to move," he said. "We're flying out." Emma knelt briefly, touching Michael's forehead, her face twisted with fear and love. "I'm right here," she whispered to him, brushing aside the sweat-dampened strands of his beard. Jim adjusted his gloves and nodded toward the plane. Rex trotted ahead again, body still charged from the attack but focused now on protecting the path forward. They finally reached the bush plane. Jim opened the cargo hatch and prepared blankets, anchoring Michael securely inside. Emma climbed in next, helping position him while Jim double-checked the bindings. The storm clouds overhead deepened, darkening the lake with a storm-gray shadow. Jim scanned the tree line once more. The fake Michael remained tied, trapped in the cold. But Jim knew more trouble could still be hidden in the wilderness. For now, though, they had survivors to save. Jim climbed into the cockpit, Rex jumping in beside him. "Let's go home," Jim whispered, firing up the engine as the propeller cut through the freezing air. The plane lifted slowly into the stormy sky, carrying them toward safety. At least for now. The storm had thickened by the time Jim Walker reached the bush plane's open door with Rex at his side. the wind dragging loose flakes sideways in sharp, stinging swirls across the frozen lake. The last echoes of the struggle had faded into the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness, leaving only the deep hum of the approaching helicopter. When the Alaska State Troopers' rescue bird finally crested over the ridge, sleek, gray-white, and armored against winter, it cut through the storm like a blade through cloth. Its spotlight swept across the ice, catching Jim, Rex, Emma, and the fading shape of the real Michael inside the plane. The rotors lowered with a harsh, slicing roar as it touched down on the lake's frozen surface, sending snow flying in concentric rings. Rex pressed close to Jim's leg, steady but watchful, as the side doors of the helicopter slid open. The first to step out was Chief Pilot Aaron Mercer, a tall man in his early 50s with a square jaw, salt and pepper beard, and deep-set blue eyes that carried the weary calm of someone who had flown too many emergency missions to count. His parka was heavy, snow-dusted, and his gloves were thick rescue issue, yet his movements were precise and practiced. Behind him was Trooper Medic Clara Haynes, a woman in her late 20s with a lean, athletic frame, fair skin, and bright auburn hair braided tightly against her head. Her green eyes scanned the area with sharp perception, professional, empathetic, and alert. She knelt immediately inside the bush plane, murmuring reassurances to Emma and Michael, her voice steady despite the roar of rotors. Aaron approached Jim with a nod that conveyed respect between two men who had both seen too much of the worst parts of humanity. Clara worked without hesitation, cutting open Michael's jacket to assess his fevered chest and placing warming packs along his sides. She murmured to Emma, who was trembling from cold and shock, placing a heavy blanket around her shoulders. Emma clung to Clara's sleeve for a moment, her pale fingers shaking as she tried to speak through numb lips. Clara's tone grew softer, promising they would take care of her husband, promising she was safe. Behind them, Rex stood at the plane's threshold, gaze locked on every movement, making certain Emma and Michael were truly being helped this time. Jim placed a gloved hand on Rex's shoulder, easing the dog slightly, though Rex's amber eyes never left the rescuers. While Clara and another trooper transferred Michael onto a stretcher and fastened him in with practiced precision, Aaron turned to the three bound criminals laid on the ice, the fake Michael, whose face twisted between pain and venom, and the two smugglers from the hidden cabin, both groaning under their restraints. Aaron's jaw tightened at the scene, understanding instantly that this was no simple wilderness accident. He signaled to his men, and the troopers moved in to secure the prisoners for transport. The fake Michael spat a curse at Jim, but Rex answered with a single, low growl, deep and cold as the wind. The man fell silent. Aaron looked back at Jim with an expression that blended gratitude with the recognition of another veteran's instinct. It said what words didn't need to. The loading of the injured and the captives took only minutes, though the storm made every step harder. Jim assisted Emma as she climbed into the helicopter, her legs shaking on the icy metal rail. She turned back to him, her brown hair whipping around her face, and mouthed the words, "Thank you," though the wind stole the sound. Michael, delirious and pale, was strapped in beside her. One trooper secured the criminals at the rear cabin, watching them closely. Clara squeezed Emma's shoulder before stepping out to speak to Jim. She asked how he found them. Jim gave only the essentials, pointing at Rex. Clara smiled with a mixture of awe and exhaustion, nodding respectfully toward the dog. She scribbled something on a small notepad. Procedural details, likely, but her eyes softened as she said that Emma and Michael owed their lives to him. The rotors wound back up, swallowing the world in sound. The helicopter lifted, snow exploding under its ascent like white fire. As it rose into the storm with its rescued souls and captured criminals, Jim shielded his face from the downdraft. Rex stood firm beside him, fur hammering in the wind, unflinching as the metal bird climbed into the gray-white heavens. The light from its beacon blinked through the snowfall until it vanished behind the ridge, leaving the frozen lake silent once again. Jim lowered his arm and exhaled a breath he didn't know he had been holding. The quiet that fell after the helicopter's departure felt different than before. Less empty, less haunted. Snow settled peacefully around Jim and Rex as they walked back to the bush plain. The storm still whispered across the lake, though the worst of the gale had begun to drift north. Jim brushed frost from the wing struts, running gloved fingers along the metal surface he'd known for years. Rex hopped lightly onto the float, turned back to look at Jim, and wagged his tail once, a small, steady gesture that cut through the cold. Jim climbed inside, dropping into the pilot's seat with the familiar creak of worn leather. The scent of engine oil, old maps, and cold air filled the cockpit. Rex settled beside him, placing one paw gently over Jim's boot, anchoring him in a way few things ever had. Before starting the engine, Jim let the silence wrap around him. Not the heavy silence of memory, but a clean one, washed by snow and renewed purpose. The storm outside had softened into a quiet flurry that tapped lightly against the canopy. He rested his hand on Rex's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes half closed but alert, the same steadfast guardian he had always been. Jim knew, deep in a place he usually kept blocked behind old walls, that this moment was different. It wasn't the escape he used to chase. It wasn't the avoidance of ghosts. It was stillness earned, not stolen. When he finally turned the ignition, the bush plane's engine roared to life, steady, confident, familiar. The sound no longer served as a shield. Instead, it felt like a companion. Jim eased the throttle, guiding the plane across the frozen lake's surface. Snow mist swirled around the floats as the engine picked up power. Rex braced with a confident stance, watching through the window as the wilderness blurred into streaks of white and gray. Jim pushed forward, the aircraft cutting cleanly across the ice until lift carried them into the wind. The world beyond the tree line opened up below them. Endless white valleys, frozen rivers carved like silver threads, and the jagged, dark silhouettes of distant peaks. In that vast canvas of winter, Jim felt something he hadn't in years, a gentle, steady warmth beneath the ribs, unmistakable and quietly overwhelming. Rex turned his head, nudging Jim's elbow once before resting it back on the console. It was simple, wordless, perfect. Jim smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from relief, but from the knowledge that he was no longer walking alone in the cold. In the quiet stillness of Alaska's frozen wilderness, Jim Walker finally understood something he had forgotten long ago. That even in the harshest storms of life, God always leaves a light burning for those who refuse to give up. Sometimes that light comes through the kindness of a stranger, sometimes through a narrow chance at survival, and sometimes it arrives in the form of a loyal companion like Rex, a reminder that we are never truly alone. Miracles don't always roar like thunder. Sometimes they arrive softly, in courage, in loyalty, in the strength to keep moving even when the world feels cold and silent. And perhaps that is how God watches over us, not by removing the storm, but by giving us the heart strong enough to walk through it. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Leave a like, share this video with someone who might need a spark of hope, and don't forget to subscribe for more upcoming journeys. May God bless you with peace, strength, and a small miracle of your own, wherever you are. Amen.